Imagine just standing on the cold stone walls of your city.
Right.
You're looking down at a river that you have known your entire life. I mean, usually you expect to see water, right? The reflection of the gray winter sky, maybe, I don't know, a few fishing skiffs fighting the current.
Just normal everyday life.
Exactly. You take it for granted as a totally static part of the geography. But on this specific morning, you look down and the water is simply gone.
It's just vanished.
Literally vanished. You look downriver and the Seine is gone. In its place is just the sea of carved timber and painted shields and iron. It's November, the year is 885 AD, and the people of Paris are looking down the river, and they see an absolute armada.
An armada that just defies belief, really.
It does. The historical sources from the time, they tell us it wasn't a dozen ships, it wasn't even 100, it was an estimated 700 longships.
Yeah, carrying tens of thousands of warriors.
Tens of thousands. The river was just hidden for miles because this wasn't, a raiding party looking for loose silver. This was a conquest.
Oh, absolutely.
So today, we're taking a deep dive into the 885 AD Great Siege of Paris. We're going to explore how, basically, a couple hundred defenders barricaded on a tiny island held off the greatest Viking army of the age for nearly a year.
And how their stubborn survival ended up bringing down the legendary dynasty of Charlemagne.
Yes. So to really understand the stakes of what those defenders were looking at that morning, we have to talk about our sources. Because we are so incredibly fortunate to have this rare lens into the event.
We really are. We aren't relying entirely on, later chronicles or educated guesses written hundreds of years after the fact. We actually have an eyewitness account.
Which is so rare for this era.
It's incredibly rare. It's from a monk named Abbo, who was literally trapped inside the walls of Paris for the entire duration of the siege.
Just stuck in the meat grinder with everyone else.
And he wrote this vivid, just brutally graphic poem called The Wars of the City of Paris. And what makes Abbo's account so valuable for us today is that it completely strips away the romanticism.
Right, there's no glorious shining knights in this.
No, not at all. He documents the actual mechanics of the violence, the daily grinding logistics of starvation, the terrifying reality of being caught in a medieval siege. He gives us the ground-level view of a city that was basically asked to sacrifice itself.
And led by a man named Count Odo, they just flatly refuse.
Which is wild.
It's so wild, because the psychological weight of that refusal is just massive. To really grasp the terrifying scale of this armada in 885, I think we have to look at the 40 years that preceded it, right?
Yeah, you have to set the stage.
Yeah.
The Frankish kingdom had basically fallen into this devastating cycle.
Right, because 40 years prior, so 845 AD Paris had already been attacked by a Viking fleet.
Famously attacked, yeah.
But back then, the Frankish king did what had basically become standard operating procedure across Europe. He just paid them off.
Right, he handed over an exorbitant ransom of silver just to make them go away. The Danegeld?
The Danegeld, the gold paid to the Danes. Which, on paper, if you're a besieged king, avoiding a slaughter sounds like a completely pragmatic political maneuver, right?
Sure, it sounds totally rational. You hand over the treasury, your citizens survive, the fields don't burn. It seems like a win.
But it was a trap.
It was a kingdom-destroying trap. Because the psychology of extortion dictates that, paying once only guarantees you're going to be asked to pay again.
Exactly.
The Vikings were highly rational economic actors. Once the Frankish kings paid them off, the Norse leadership realized that Francia was essentially a bottomless ATM.
Yeah, governed by men who would rather bleed their own treasuries dry than actually stand and fight.
Right, so the behavior of the fleets radically escalated after that. They stopped being just seasonal raiders.
Because in the early days of the Viking Age, a crew would just show up in the spring, right? They'd hit a monastery or a coastal town, grab what they could, and sail back to Scandinavia before the autumn storms hit.
Exactly. It was a smash-and-grab operation. But after the Danegeld started flowing, they transitioned into this grinding, permanent occupation.
They started building those heavily fortified winter camps, right? The long forts.
Yes, right on the Frankish rivers. And they used these secure river bases to launch sustained year-round campaigns deep into the agricultural heartlands. They weren't just visiting anymore.
No, they had moved in. They integrated themselves into the landscape.
And the Frankish response to this occupation was just paralyzed by severe political decay.
Yeah.
We are talking about the descendants of Charlemagne here.
Who was this singular titan, obviously.
Right. He united Western Europe into a massive empire. But by the late 9th century, his heirs had completely fractured that unity. Through just endless successions and civil wars, the empire had been divided, recombined, divided again.
And the ruler sitting on the imperial throne during our siege in 885 is a guy named Charles the Fat.
Good old Charles the Fat.
Which is just a brutal historical nickname, but Charles had actually managed to nominally reunite the empire, right?
Nominally being the key word there.
Yeah, through a series of deaths and inheritances, he suddenly ruled this vast territory stretching across modern-day France, Germany, and Italy.
But the man was just a hollow shell wearing his great ancestor's crown.
The sources basically universally describe him as dangerously incompetent, and he was prone to illness, too.
Yeah, the empire was reunited in name only. At its core, the centralized military structure that Charlemagne had built up, it had completely dissolved.
So local lords and city governors realized very quickly that, hey, if a Viking fleet shows up on our river, the emperor is not going to send an army to save us. We are totally on our own.
Which forces a radical shift in local infrastructure. Amidst all this imperial decay, the authority of Paris decides to take its survival into its own hands.
They learned the hard way from that disaster in 845.
Exactly. They knew they were a prime target sitting on a major arterial river, so they initiated a massive upgrade to their defenses.
And the geography of Paris at this time is so crucial to visualize if you want to understand this siege, because we are not talking about the sprawling modern metropolis with the Eiffel Tower.
Oh, no, not at all.
The defensible heart of 9th century Paris was strictly the Ile de la Cité. It's this natural kind of boat-shaped island sitting right smack in the middle of the River Seine.
Where Notre Dame is today, essentially.
Exactly. And by 885, the Parisians had fortified the entire perimeter of this island with massive stone walls. But the real masterstroke, the upgrade that basically changes the entire strategic reality of Northern Europe, is the bridges.
The bridges are everything.
They built 2 fortified bridges connecting the island to both the north and south banks of the river. You have the Grand Pont and the Petit Pont. And at the end of each bridge, sitting on the river banks themselves, they built these heavy defensive stone and wood towers.
The châtelets.
Right. And the strategic genius of these bridges, it's all about how they interact with Viking technology, isn't it?
Absolutely, because the undisputed superweapon of the Viking Age was the longship.
Oh, yeah.
It was clinker-built, meaning its hull planks overlapped, which made it incredibly flexible in rough seas. But far more importantly for our story, it had a remarkably shallow draft.
Right, it didn't sit deep in the water at all.
Exactly. A ship carrying 50 fully armed men could navigate a river that was less than a meter deep.
Which is just insane.
It is. It allowed the Vikings to completely bypass coastal defenses and strike hundreds of miles inland with terrifying speed. They were masters of maneuver warfare. They basically relied on the waterways as an uncontested highway system.
But the Parisians designed these new bridges specifically to neutralize that advantage.
Yes, they did.
Because the bridges were built super low to the water. A long ship with its tall mast and that high curving prow, it cannot simply sail or even row underneath them.
It's physically impossible.
And because the bridges span the entire width of the river, from the island to the banks, they physically barricaded the Seine.
Yeah.
Paris basically engineered a massive structural choke point. If you want to think about the hydrodynamics of it, the island and the low bridges function like a giant cork rammed into the bottom of the river.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
Because if the Vikings want to get past Paris, they want to access the incredibly rich, totally unplundered lands of Burgundy further upstream, they have to pull that cork out of the bottle.
Right.
They lose their speed. They lose their bypass capability. The architecture forces them to stop, disembark, and fight a grinding stationary siege, which is the exact type of warfare they usually try to avoid at all costs.
They hate sieges.
They do. Which brings us back to late November 885. The massive fleet of 700 ships pulls up to this fortified island. They're commanded by a coalition of chieftains, including a very prominent leader named Siegfried.
Now, wait, if I'm trying to picture the logistics of this, how do 700 ships even fit on the Seine without just bottlenecking themselves into total chaos?
Oh, the river would have been an absolute nightmare of congestion.
Right.
The ships would have been beached along the banks for miles downstream. They'd be rafted together in the current, essentially creating this massive floating wooden city.
Just the smell and the noise of it must have been overwhelming.
Oh, the logistics of feeding and organizing tens of thousands of men in a winter encampment of that scale, it's staggering. And because the Vikings are fully aware of the sheer misery that a winter siege will entail, their opening move is surprisingly diplomatic.
Yeah, this is the part that always gets me. Siegfried approaches the city. He doesn't immediately launch a barrage of flaming arrows or, send men screaming at the
No,
walls.
no, he's a businessman, in a way.
He requests a parley with the leadership of Paris. That's Count Odo, who's the military commander, and Bishop Gozlin, who is sort of the religious and civic leader. And Siegfried essentially makes them an offer.
A very polite offer, all things considered.
He literally says, hey, we have no quarrel with Paris. We don't want to spend the winter freezing and dying outside your walls. All we want is permission to pass.
Just let us through.
Open the bridges, let our ships row upstream to ravage the lands of Burgundy, and we will leave your city completely untouched.
It is a shockingly rational proposition. Siegfried is applying pressure,
Yeah.
outlining a mutually beneficial outcome. He wants the wealth upstream, and Paris is merely in the way. If they step aside, they live.
I have to admit, if I am standing on that wall, looking out at a horizon, completely choked with enemy warriors, and I know the Emperor isn't coming to help us, human preservation alone screams at you to pull the lever and let them through.
Oh, absolutely.
If their leader explicitly says, we just want to go rob your neighbor, we won't touch you, the temptation to make it someone else's problem must have been just overwhelming.
Especially under the political logic that the Frankish kings had been operating on for decades. Opening the gates was the standard play, let them ravage someone else's land, right?
Exactly.
But Bishop Gozlin and Count Odo, they understood the deeper mechanism of their duty. Giving the Vikings a free pass meant deliberately betraying the heartland of the empire.
Yeah.
Paris was the gateway. They were the shield. If they stepped aside to save themselves, they were condemning thousands of innocent farmers and monks and citizens upriver to death and enslavement.
Which is a heavy burden.
It is. They accepted the terrifying moral responsibility of holding the door shut, knowing it meant bringing the full, concentrated fury of this armada down upon their own heads.
They chose the hard path. They looked down at Siegfried and just told him no. And hey, by the way, for anyone listening to this deep dive who is a fan of the television show Vikings,
Oh yeah, great show.
you might remember the incredible siege of Paris depicted in the series. They show this heavily fortified, walled city with defensive towers on the riverbanks and low bridges blocking the ships.
Right.
The show actually bases that dramatic, brutal struggle on this specific siege in 885 rather than the earlier sack in 845. The stubborn, desperate, grinding defense you see on screen, it perfectly captures the spirit of what Odo and Gozlin were doing here.
They really committed their city to a fight where the mathematics were just fundamentally broken.
Completely broken. Let's analyze those numbers because they dictate the entire nature of the siege. We have an attacking force numbering in the tens of thousands. Inside the city walls, the sources indicate the fighting garrison consisted of perhaps 200 professional men-at-arms.
200.
200 guys. Against an army that literally darkens the river. I mean, by any conventional military logic of the 9th century, you cannot stretch 200 men across an island perimeter, 2 bridge spans, and 2 riverbank towers and expect to hold.
No, it should have been a slaughter within 48 hours.
So how does this actually play out physically? Because this is where Ebbo's eyewitness account gets incredibly dark. The Vikings didn't just swing axes at stone.
No, they didn't. They engaged in high-level, mechanized siege warfare.
Which is wild to think about.
It is, because we often think of the Vikings purely as, light infantry.
Yeah.
Guys with shields and axes jumping off boats. But they were highly adaptable engineers.
Yeah.
When intimidation failed, they mobilized the surrounding forests. Abbo describes them constructing massive siege engines right on the riverbanks. They built mangons. These are heavy traction trebuchets and torsion-powered catapults. They're assembling complex artillery to hurl massive stones, trying to systematically smash the wooden defenses on top of those stone towers.
And Abbo also details the use of massive battering rams. And we're not talking about just a log carried by a few guys.
No, these are industrial scale.
These are massive tree trunks, capped with iron, suspended by chains inside heavy wooden frames with protective roofs. They were designed to be rolled right up to the bases of the chalets.
But to get a heavy rolling structure up to the wall, the Vikings first had to deal with the defensive ditches the Parisians had dug around those towers.
Right, you can't roll a massive wooden frame over a moat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this leads to, honestly, one of the most psychologically horrific tactics of the entire siege. To bring the rams forward, the Vikings needed to create causeways across these deep ditches. So they started filling them with earth, timber, rubble. But the volume required was immense, and under constant fire from the walls, Gathering dirt was just too slow.
Yeah.
So Abbo records that they began filling the trenches with the bodies of slaughtered livestock.
Oh, God.
And when that wasn't enough, they used the bodies of executed captives.
Wait, really? They literally built a bridge out of people.
Yes, they built ramps of flesh and bone just to roll their siege engines up to the walls.
That is absolute nightmare fuel. I mean, it's purely psychological warfare designed to make the defenders break and surrender.
Totally. But the Parisians held.
They held.
Yeah.
So the Vikings turned their attention back to the real problem, the bridges. Because if they could burn the wooden spans of the bridges, the core could be removed.
Right, the fire is the key.
Abbo vividly describes this totally coordinated naval attack where the Vikings took 3 of their own longships, packed the hulls completely full of dry timber, straw, and combustible pitch.
Just massive floating bombs.
Exactly. Set them entirely ablaze and released them into the river current.
And the current of the Seine in winter is fast and heavy. The objective was to let these blazing fire ships slam right into the wooden pilings of the bridges. If the fire caught the bridge supports, the wind would just carry it across the entire structure, destroying the blockade and finally opening the river.
So if you're one of the 200 guys on the wall, how do you even fight back against artillery, corpse ramps, and fire ships?
You get creative.
Yeah.
And brutal.
They had to rely on the verticality of their defenses and a really ruthless application of medieval chemistry.
Right.
They actually managed to sink or divert the fire ships before they could ignite the main bridge structures by dropping massive stones from the walls to crush the hulls.
Which is incredible timing and aim, honestly.
Yeah. And to repel the infantry swarming the bases of the towers, they utilized horrific defensive liquids. Abbo specifically writes about the defenders pouring boiling pitch, hot oil, and molten wax down onto the attackers.
And we really need to talk about the physics of those materials, because that's what makes them so devastating.
Yeah, break that down for us.
Boiling water will scald you, right? It's terrible. But it cools relatively quickly and runs off your armor. Pitch, which is a highly viscous, sticky resin derived from pine tar and molten wax, they function very differently.
Oh, man.
When boiling pitch hits a warrior, it adheres. It clings to chainmail. It seeps right through thick cloth, and it sticks directly to the skin while maintaining this incredibly high thermal mass.
So it just keeps burning.
It burns continuously. It is a terrifying area denial weapon. When you are outnumbered 100 to 1, you don't fight fair, you know.
No, absolutely not.
You use whatever inflicts the maximum amount of localized agony to break the morale of the assault force.
So the daily reality for the defenders is just this exhausting, endless terror. You fight hand-to-hand on the narrow bridges all day long, repelling waves of fresh attackers, and then night falls. But you can't sleep.
No rest at all.
The freezing winter temperature drops, and you have to spend the dark hours frantically repairing the shattered timber of the towers, hauling stones back up to the battlements, and basically brewing the pitch for the next dawn.
And this grueling rhythm continues, not just for days, but for months.
Months?
They enter the deep freeze of the winter of 885 and early 886. The landscape outside the walls is picked completely clean by the besieging army. Inside the city, the food stores rapidly dwindle, starvation sets in.
Yeah, the calorie deficit alone.
Right. Disease spreads through the cramped, freezing island. And it's during this specific period of extreme vulnerability that the leadership takes a catastrophic hit.
Oh, right.
Bishop Gozlan, who had been this massive physical presence on the walls, rallying the men, fighting right alongside them, he contracts an illness and dies.
The loss in Gozlan is just a devastating blow. He wasn't just a man of the cloth, he was a strategic pillar of the city's resistance. When he dies, you have to imagine the morale of the starving garrison was teetering on the absolute edge of collapse.
Hanging by a thread.
And nature, in its infinite cruelty, decides to kick them while they are down. In early February, the weather suddenly shifts. A rapid thaw causes the River Seine to swell into a violent flood.
Yeah, the hydrodynamics of the Paris Basin mean that winter thaws funnel just massive volumes of water down the Seine.
Like a flash flood.
Basically.
Yeah.
The rushing, debris-filled floodwaters put immense pressure on the wooden pilings of the bridges. And finally, the smaller of the two bridges, the Petit Pont, gives way. A large central section of the wooden span is entirely washed away by the current.
And the snapping of that bridge creates an immediate, terrifying tactical crisis. Because of the broken span, the defensive tower sitting on the south bank of the river is suddenly completely physically cut off from the main island of Paris.
Right. There is absolutely no way for the garrison on the island to reinforce them or send supplies over.
None. And the Vikings recognize the structural failure instantly.
They're right on it.
They isolate the tower, inside that specific châtelet, the sources tell us there were only 12 men.
12.
12 defenders, completely surrounded by thousands of Vikings, cut off by a freezing, flooded river.
And the Vikings approach the tower and actually demand their surrender. They offer them their lives if they simply lay down their arms and hand over the fortification.
Which, again, seems completely rational.
Right. But these 12 men, knowing perfectly well that no rescue is coming, knowing the bridge is gone and their situation is utterly hopeless, they refuse.
They choose to fight to the absolute last breath.
They do. The Vikings swarm the tower, and it just becomes a brutal, close-quarters slaughter. Every single one of those 12 men is killed.
It is such a profound tragedy, and Abo specifically records their names in his poem to immortalize their sacrifice, which is really moving. They died rather than yield a single stone to the enemy.
But strategically, the fall of that tower is a total disaster.
Yeah.
The Vikings now control the south bank entirely. The cork is cracking.
Yeah.
The pressure on the starving city is now critical, and Emperor Charles the Fat has sent absolutely no reinforcements.
None. The city is bleeding out, they are starving, freezing, and fundamentally abandoned. It is at this breaking point that Count Odo decides the time for waiting is over.
He's had enough.
He commits to one of the most legendary, desperate gambles in medieval military history. He decides he has to break out of the city and find the emperor himself.
The sheer audacity of this plan cannot be overstated, really. Odo places the city under the command of his trusted deputies, and under the cover of darkness, he personally slips out of the fortified gates of Paris.
Alone, or with a small guard.
Very small group, maybe alone at points. He has to navigate through an encampment of tens of thousands of hostile warriors, avoiding patrols, sentries, and that massive fleet we talked about.
Which is basically a suicide mission.
Pretty much. But he utilizes his intimate knowledge of the local geography, manages to evade the blockade, and rides furiously out into the Frankish countryside.
Wow.
He tracks down the imperial court of Charles the Fat, and he stands before the emperor. He delivers this desperate message, detailing the starvation of his people, the heroism of the defense, and the absolute necessity of an imperial relief army.
He essentially shames the emperor into action, right?
Yeah, Charles, faced with the undeniable courage of Odo, and frankly, the political reality that losing Paris would leave the entire interior of his empire completely defenseless, he finally agrees to mobilize a massive imperial army.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of Odo's situation right at this exact moment. He has successfully broken out. He's delivered the message. The emperor is gathering the army. Odo's mission is fully accomplished, and he is safe behind the lines of the imperial vanguard.
He's won.
He's won. The logical expected behavior for a nobleman in his position would be to ride comfortably alongside the massive army as they march back to relieve the city.
That would be the aristocratic standard, absolutely. You've done your duty, now you let the imperial military machine do its work.
But Odo doesn't do that. Odo leaves the safety of the emperor's camp, rides back ahead of the army, approaches the edge of the Viking blockade surrounding Paris, and then he literally fights his way back through the enemy lines to get back inside the doomed city.
It's incredible, and we have to analyze the psychology of that decision. By fighting his way back through a hostile army to return to a freezing, starving garrison, Odo is executing a profound display of comitatus. You know, that ancient warrior bond between a leader and his men.
Yeah.
He is explicitly telling the people of Paris, I will not abandon you to wait in safety. I will suffer the hunger with you, and if these walls fall, I will fall with you.
It is the absolute antithesis of the leadership Charles the Fat was demonstrating.
Precisely. It cemented Odo not just as a military commander, but as a living legend. It was a visceral projection of frontline leadership that the Carolingian dynasty had completely forgotten how to manifest.
Right.
Odo proved his legitimacy to rule not through his bloodline, but through his willingness to bleed.
So Odo is back inside. His return provides the massive psychological boost the defenders need to hold on just a little bit longer. And finally, after nearly a year of unimaginable suffering, the moment they have been praying for arrives. Over the horizon, the banners of Emperor Charles the Fat appear. He is marching on Paris with a massive, united imperial army.
The geography of the Parisian basin, specifically the heights of Montmartre to the north, would have allowed the defenders to literally see this massive force assembling.
Oh, wow.
The Great Relief Army is finally here.
Imagine the sheer overwhelming relief inside those walls. You've held out for almost 12 months, you've buried your friends, you've eaten rats, you've fought off fire and artillery, and now the emperor has arrived to crush the besiegers.
The tactical setup is absolutely perfect.
It really is. The hammer is about to strike the anvil. The Viking forces are now trapped squarely between the impenetrable stone walls of Paris and the overwhelming numerical might of the emperor's army. It's the perfect textbook scenario for a decisive, annihilating victory.
It is the exact moment the entire grinding ordeal has been building toward. The Vikings are outmaneuvered, they're cornered, the siege is over, the battle is about to begin.
And what actually happens next is one of the most infuriating, gut-wrenching political betrayals in European history.
It defies belief. It really does. Charles the Fat arrives with complete tactical superiority, and he refuses to order an attack.
Unbelievable.
He does not draw his sword. Instead, he halts his army, pitches a luxurious imperial tent, and sends envoys to invite the Viking chieftains to negotiate.
You have to imagine the defenders standing on the walls, covered in pitch and freezing mud, watching their emperor literally invite the men who slaughtered the 12 defenders of the tower to a sit-down meeting.
Just having a chat. And Charles the Fat negotiates a peace treaty. He agrees to pay the Vikings a massive sum of silver, yet another Danegeld, if they simply agree to lift the siege and leave the immediate vicinity of Paris.
After everything that city endured to prove they didn't have to pay the Danegeld, the emperor just pays it anyway.
Yeah.
But the betrayal goes so much deeper than the silver, doesn't it?
Oh, it gets infinitely worse. We have to remember Siegfried's original request back in November. What did he want?
He wanted to sail upriver to sack Burgundy.
Right. And Odo and Goslin refused to let him pass, explicitly because Burgundy was Frankish territory.
Yeah.
They endured a year of hell to protect those people.
Yeah.
But Charles the Fat operates on a completely different, purely cynical political calculus. You see, the region of Burgundy, under a local leader named Boso of Provence, happened to be in a state of political rebellion against Charles's imperial authority at that particular moment. So as part of his grand peace deal, the emperor doesn't just pay the Vikings to leave. He explicitly grants the Viking armada permission to sail upriver and sack his own rebellious territory of Burgundy.
It's hard to even process the cowardice of that decision. He basically weaponizes a foreign invading army against his own vassals just to avoid fighting a battle and to simultaneously punish a domestic political rival.
He essentially hires the men who have been murdering Parisians for a year to go do his dirty work upstream.
It is the ultimate humiliation for the city. It makes an absolute mockery of the year-long defense.
It really does. Charles effectively told Odo and every citizen of Paris that their sacrifice, their starvation, and their dead meant absolutely nothing to the crown.
If I'm Odo, watching this unfold from the battlements, the rage must have been blinding. Everything they bled for was instantly nullified by a stroke of a pen.
But the reaction from Paris is what elevates this story from a tragedy into a masterclass in defiance. Because even though their emperor, their supreme sovereign, the man ordained by God to rule them, had officially signed a treaty and explicitly ordered the city to open the bridges and let the Vikings pass, the defenders of Paris still refused.
Yes. They stood on those walls, looked at the emperor's royal decree, looked at the Viking fleet, and basically said, no. We didn't boil men alive in pitch and freeze for 12 months just to become a toll booth for your political schemes.
They absolutely refused to open the water gates or dismantle the blockades. The emperor's command was entirely irrelevant to them at this point. The cork was staying firmly in the bottle.
So, mechanically what happens? The emperor says the Vikings have safe passage to Burgundy, but Paris physically will not let the ships float through the bridges. How do the Vikings get upstream?
This leads to one of the most surreal, visually staggering, and undeniable images of the entire Viking Age.
I love this part.
The Vikings realize that the Parisians are genuinely never going to open those gates, and they don't want to restart the siege just to pass through. So to get to Burgundy, they are forced to literally drag their fleet overland.
Overland. Let's think about the sheer physical labor of that for a second. A fully loaded Viking longship is a massive piece of oak engineering. We are talking about vessels that can weigh upwards of 15 tons.
15 tons of wood. They had to haul these massive ships out of the freezing water, hoist them onto wooden rollers, and use sheer human and animal muscle to drag hundreds of hulls through the mud.
That is insane.
Physically hauling them entirely around the massive stone walls of Paris until they could slide them back into the Seine, safely upstream of the bridges.
It is astonishing. The sheer immovable stubbornness of a few hundred surviving Parisians forced an army of tens of thousands of warriors to drag an armada through the dirt.
It was a final, undeniable act of defiance. The Parisians would not yield the river. If the Vikings wanted to pass, they were going to have to
Walk their boats.
Yeah.
So zooming out to the macro level, what are the mechanisms of fallout from this? We have a city that definitively proved it could hold out against impossible odds, and an emperor who definitively proved he was a coward who would sell out his own people.
The fallout changes the entire political trajectory of European history because the contrast between Charles the Fat and Count Odo was so stark, so publicly undeniable, that it utterly shattered whatever remaining illusion of authority the Carolingian dynasty possessed.
The nobility of Francia looked at the mechanics of Charles's leadership and realized the imperial contract was just broken.
Exactly. The fundamental foundational contract of feudalism is mutual obligation. The vassal provides taxes and military service, and the lord provides protection.
Right.
Charles completely failed the protection clause, while Odo fulfilled it beyond all expectations. Within just 2 years of this siege, the political structure of the empire revolted. The nobility completely abandoned Charles the Fat. In 887, he was formally deposed, stripped of his titles and his power.
And with his deposition, the grand unified vision of Charlemagne's empire fractures permanently. It never comes back together. But the central authority still needs a figurehead. The territory of West Francia, what will eventually become France, needs a king. How does that vacuum get filled?
Well, the nobility calls an assembly to elect a new king, and they choose Count Odo.
That is a massive paradigm shift in medieval political philosophy.
It is completely revolutionary. For generations, the crown was determined strictly by dynastic bloodline. The idea was that you had the divine right to rule simply because you carried the blood of Charlemagne.
Right, it was just inherited.
But the election of Odo represents a profound shift toward feudal meritocracy. Odo had no royal blood. He was elevated to the throne solely based on capability and proven leadership. He became king because he was the man who stood on the walls and actually protected the people.
He earned the crown in the freezing mud and boiling pitch of Paris. And by electing Odo, the nobility sets a new precedent that reverberates for centuries.
Because while Odo himself doesn't establish a permanent dynasty immediately, his elevation breaks the Carolingian monopoly. It paves the exact path for his descendant, a man named Hugh Capet, who was elected king in 987.
The Capetians.
Yes, Hugh Capet founds the Capetian dynasty, the royal house that will rule France in one form or another for the next 800 years. They are the dynasty that literally builds the French nation. And that entire monumental shift in European power originates right here, in the ashes of the siege of 885, when a local count chose to fight and an emperor chose to pay.
It's just wild to think about. Let's tie this back to the broader mechanics of the Viking Age itself. Because this deep dive isn't just about Frankish dynastic politics, it's about how Europe adapted to the Norse threat as a whole.
True.
The Siege of Paris created a fascinating paradox. First, it proved mechanically that heavily fortified, well-defended bridges and walls could actually neutralize the Viking advantage of speed and force them into a stalemate.
It gave Europe a blueprint for defense. But the second part of that paradox is that while the cities could hold out, the central Frankish government proved entirely incapable of fielding an army to actually drive the Vikings out of the countryside. Charles the Fat's reliance on the Danegeld proved the empire was militarily impotent in the field.
So you end up with this brutal equilibrium. The Vikings can't easily crack the major fortified cities anymore, but the Franks can't push the Vikings off the rivers. They are stuck in a bleeding stalemate. But a generation later, in the year 911 AD, a new Frankish king looks at this unsolvable equation and tries a radically different political mechanism.
Yeah, if you lack the military infrastructure to defeat an occupying army, and your treasury can no longer support the massive economic drain of paying the Danegeld, what is your remaining option? You assimilate them. You hire the wolf to guard the sheep.
I love that. In 911, the Frankish king Charles the Simple makes a formal treaty with a massive Viking fleet commander. He basically tells this chieftain, I will grant you vast tracts of land at the mouth of the river Seine. I will give you a legitimate noble title. In exchange, you convert to Christianity, swear fealty to me, and use your fleet to physically block any other Viking armies trying to sail up the river.
And that Viking chieftain's name was Rollo.
Rollo.
The treaty they signed, the Treaty of St. Clair-Sarepta, directly creates the Duchy of Normandy, the land of the Northmen.
Which is an incredible historical domino effect, because giving land to Rollo to solve the Viking problem on the Seine directly creates the Norman power base. And it is Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, William the Conqueror, who will sail across the Channel in 1066 and conquer England.
It is all seamlessly connected. The weakness exposed by Charles the Fat at Paris in 8085 necessitates the desperate political strategy of giving land to Rollo in 911, which fundamentally alters the history of the British Isles a century and a half later.
It is staggering to trace those lines. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to hand it over to you to contextualize what we've unpacked today. We spend so much time looking at the macro-level forces of history. The treaties, the royal lineages, the sweeping economic trends. But what does the reality of Paris in 885 actually teach us?
I think it teaches us a vital lesson about the mechanics of historical change. We're so conditioned to believe that history is shaped exclusively by kings, emperors, and these vast impersonal forces. But the Siege of Paris reminds us that the trajectory of the world is often violently and decisively altered by the sheer stubborn refusal of ordinary people to step aside. Think about the contrast we've explored today. Emperor Charles the Fat possessed the titles, the wealth, and the overwhelming military power. He looked at a crisis and chose what he considered pragmatism. He chose the path of least resistance, treating his own people as expendable pawns on a political chessboard. And he lost his entire empire because of it.
He lost everything.
Conversely, Count Odo, Bishop Goslin, and a few hundred starving, freezing, exhausted men trapped on a small island chose a path that looked mathematically suicidal. They refused the easy out. They refused to open the gates and let the destruction pass on to someone else. They chose absolute, uncompromising defiance. And in doing so, they brought down an empire, birthed a new dynasty, and changed the map of Europe.
Wow.
It leaves you with a profound question to ponder in your own life. When you are faced with overwhelming pressure to compromise your core duties, to simply pay the toll and let destructive forces pass you by because it's easier, what are the long-term consequences of stepping aside? And conversely, what is the true, terrifying power of simply refusing to open the gate?
That is exactly the right note to end on. Next time, we are crossing the channel back over to England, and we are fast-forwarding the timeline to one of the darkest, most pivotal days of the era, St. Brice's Day, in the year 1002 AD.
Oh, that's a heavy one.
It is. An English king orders the sudden, sweeping massacre of Danes living within his borders, claiming a royal victim in the process, and unleashes a terrifying, kingdom-shattering vengeance that changes England forever. If you've watched the show Vikings, Valhalla, this is the exact brutal historical event that kicks off the entire series. You will not want to miss diving into the mechanics of that disaster. Thank you for joining us on the freezing walls of Paris today. Until next time, keep your bridges fortified and never ever pay the Danegeld.